Walker and I have had the privilege and opportunity to go to El Salvador, I think 3 times now, and it's just incredible to see how much it's changed over the years.
Yeah, El Salvador made history as the first country to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender. They also started stacking Bitcoin for a strategic reserve. I hear we're going to start stacking Bitcoin rather than just confiscating in the US, but I'm not sure and I'm not holding my breath. But regardless, in El Salvador, Bitcoin adoption did not start from the top down. It didn't start from the government. It started from the bottom up. It started from a little surf town called El Zonte, or you may know it as Bitcoin Beach.
But is El Salvador still Bitcoin country? Let's find out in a spicy debate between Joseph Dividends of the Great Fiat Times and Mike Peterson, director of Bitcoin Beach.
Please give them a warm welcome to the stage. Warmer.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. What a wonderful view. Good afternoon, everyone. How are you all feeling? You feeling good? Ready for a debate? Yeah? It's going to get spicy. Take a seat, Mike. Take a seat. Now, as Carla alluded to, I am about to transform myself into the great fiat journalist, Joseph Dividends of the Great Fiat Times. In the meantime, I'm going to ask Mike Peterson to introduce himself. Before that, and just for the record, usually I'm Joe Nakamoto, and usually I'm quite pro Bitcoin in El Salvador, and that El Salvador is still Bitcoin country. But we want to have a fun, spicy debate. So I'm going to get changed now, and over to you, Mike, to introduce yourself.
I appreciate Joe indulging me. I told him he's put out several videos, actually, about El Salvador. So if you guys get a chance, make sure you check out his channel. But the way he does their videos, they're very nuanced. They're not like pro, and they're not negative. He really looks at, is Bitcoin working, where it is working, where it's not. And so he actually does one of the better jobs of really portraying the reality on the ground in El Salvador. But I always joke that he's hating on El Salvador. So I made him put this outfit on here so that we could have the debate today.
Thank you, Mike.
Just a little bit about myself. My name is Mike Peterson, one of the founders of Bitcoin Beach in El Salvador. For those of you who don't know, we started this project back in 2019. Originally moved down to El Salvador, working with a number of churches and missionaries, and we were working in a community trying to keep young people from joining the gangs. Historically, El Salvador was really the center of the gang universe. It had the highest murder rate in the world. Quite a contrast today where it has one of the lowest murder rates in the world, which we'll get into a little bit here. But we were working in the community there, and we started using Bitcoin in the projects, paying young people in Bitcoin, and we saw this kind of change happen in them. It was kind of like this missing element of economic development. You see all these aid and NGOs, working throughout the world, but a lot of times you don't really see anything happening or any transformation happening. And we saw when we started using Bitcoin rather than fiat, it kind of unlocked these young people's minds and not just kept keeping them out of the gangs, but actually making them think for the first time about their future, lowering their time preference, encouraging them to go back to school. And so Bitcoin Beach really started as this small grassroots project, really to help the young people. And from that, El Salvador eventually adopted Bitcoin as their as legal tender, and it became this kind of worldwide phenomenon. And then more recently, with El Salvador taking a loan from the IMF, there's been a lot of backlash and a lot of people questioning, is El Salvador still Bitcoin country? So I pushed Joe to make this a little spicy today so we could really get into it and answer the hard questions. Is El Salvador still Bitcoin country?
It was a wonderful opening gambit. Please give a round of applause to Mike. But now, for those of you at the back, these are rare collectibles known as dollar bills. I am now Joseph Dividends from the Great Fiat Times, and this is my opening gambit regarding whether or not El Salvador is still Bitcoin country. Because when El Salvador made Bitcoin legal tender in 2021, it was ostensibly Bitcoin country. It was the only place on earth where you could, in theory, live entirely on Bitcoin. You could buy a coffee at Starbucks with Bitcoin. You could get a burger at McDonald's with Bitcoin. Hell, you could even do my favorite thing, paying taxes in Bitcoin. And for a while, it inspired millions of Bitcoin people all over the room. It inspired some of you in this room today. Sorry, all over the world, not the room. It showed that a nation state could take Bitcoin seriously. 4 years later, I believe, as Joseph Dividends, that moment is over. After the $1.4 billion loan from my beloved institution, the IMF, Bitcoin is no longer legal tender. Businesses are no longer required to accept Bitcoin, and government involvement has been scaled back tremendously. The nation-state Bitcoin wallet has been sidelined, thank God. New Bitcoin purchases from the nation-state wallet have been frozen, and the much-promised Bitcoin City is still just a rather dodgy AI render. The reality on the ground is that outside of communities like El Sonte or Bitcoin Berlin, which, as Mike mentioned, my nemesis, Joe Nakamoto, has documented and has visited, most Salvadoran merchants never accepted Bitcoin in the first place, and most of these big brands like Starbucks or McDonald's have dropped Bitcoin, and some of them dropped it a long time ago. Bitcoin in El Salvador feels more like marketing than monetary policy. The government does use Bitcoin imagery to attract investment, to attract tourism, to attract some of the lovely people in this room today, but the real experiment, the one that mattered to you guys, that Bitcoin is money, that's being carried out by these strange Bitcoiner people, such as Mike, not by the state. So yes, El Salvador was Bitcoin country, but right now it's just Bitcoin branding. It's not Bitcoin reality. And that is the question, that is my case that I want to unpack with you today, Mike, that El Salvador is no longer Bitcoin country. So, how would you respond to my opening gambit, the idea that yes, maybe 4 years ago, Bitcoin was a somewhat Bitcoin country, and nowadays that dream has somewhat faded?
I think it's very ironic that is the narrative you see a lot of times in the mainstream press, that they're saying, oh, it was Bitcoin country in the past and it no longer is, when the reality on the ground is Bitcoin is being used more day to day now than it ever was. When the announcement was made, a lot of people weren't ready. The tools weren't ready. They didn't work that well. The companies that were trying to accept Bitcoin, it got pushed on them like overnight. And so you'd go and try to use Bitcoin and the payments would fail. And so it had all this hype and everybody expected that overnight it was going to become Bitcoin country, that people would stop using the dollars. And I remember cautioning people at that time saying, hey, a year from now, people are going to say this was a total failure. 3 or 4 years, people say, it's worked okay, but 10 years from now, they'll be like, oh, of course it was obvious, that El Salvador's Bitcoin experiment was going to work and that they were going to lead the way forward. And it's pretty much played out like that. It really, in the first year, there was all this hype and all this excitement, but a lot of the actual transactions were not happening. There was all kinds of technological issues. There was issues people getting up to speed. And we see now, as the government, we get into it a little bit with the IMF, they have made some concessions to the IMF, and people are very upset about that. But they're actually concessions that I think the IMF was doing the government a favor by putting these kind of requirements on them for the IMF loan. And we see now more businesses than ever using Bitcoin, more everyday people actually understanding Bitcoin, and actually some people now that businesses that they're not being required to accept it, now they want to accept it. I think there's a lot of people like me, when somebody tells me I have to do something, I want to say, no, I'm not going to do that. But now that the government's not telling them they have to, they're more open to it. So kind of getting into the IMF thing, because I think this is at the crux. This is what has brought...
Before we get there, can I just challenge you with one specific example of how Bitcoin is day-to-day money in El Salvador was posited as the future, and then 4 years later, we've seen this great reversal. The government got behind this Chivo wallet, and famously they airdropped, for want of a better word, $30 to all Salvadorans across the country. 4 years later, very few Salvadorans are using Bitcoin in Chivo. And on top of that, Chivo wallet was deprioritized in that the government has reduced its support and its marketing for this day-to-day Bitcoin wallet that any Salvadoran could use to easily change between dollars and Bitcoin. So surely that's a counter-argument for the fact that more and more Salvadorans, more and more Bitcoiners in El Salvador are using Bitcoin as money.
Well, I think I can speak for all Bitcoiners when I say, really the last thing we want is a government wallet to hold our Bitcoin in. So I think initially their intentions were good. They wanted to help, spur the adoption. There was some great tools in the Chivo wallet as far as people could go back and forth between dollars and Bitcoin with zero fees, zero commissions that the government was essentially subsidizing. So I think the government's intentions in launching the Chivo wallet, they really did want to make sure that Bitcoin adoption was brought to the masses and was accessible. Right. But as we all know, governments tend not to do things very well, and we've seen that unfortunately with the Chivo wallet. It was kind of a disaster from the get-go, and because they've also tried to comply with a lot of dictates brought to them from the United States and other governments as far as KYC and AML, it's become a disaster to use. And for me, if somebody wants to receive payment in the Chivo wallet, I say, hey, do it at your own risk, because if your wallet gets frozen after I send my mixed coins to it, then I'm not going to be responsible to it, because we've had that issue. So I think that the government wallet going away is actually a plus. Okay. And I think the IMF putting that as one of the conditions for giving them a loan actually gave the government an out to be able to gracefully exit from the Chivo wallet and say, well, our hands are being forced on this, but it actually allows them to get out of something that I think there was no long-term reason for them to be in it. I think in the short term, it did play a positive role. And so I think if it just kind of gradually fades into the distance, then nobody will complain about that.
Okay, interesting point. I like the approach there. But okay, let's talk about the IMF in particular, because the IMF deal literally rolled back the Bitcoin law. Merchants do not have to accept Bitcoin. I would argue that the vast majority didn't accept Bitcoin in the first place. And on top of that, the government stopped buying Bitcoin as part of this IMF law. And as you mentioned, Chivo has been sidelined, but now you frame it as this could actually be a good thing. But surely this IMF loan and the restrictions therein, in particular the purchase of Bitcoin and the repeal of the Bitcoin law, surely that shows that El Salvador is moving farther away from being a Bitcoin country, not towards becoming a Bitcoin country.
So one thing that a lot of Bitcoiners never really understood is El Salvador was always going to take this IMF loan, because if they didn't, they were going to default on their debt. I mean, you talk to anybody in the finance field, there was no way for them to roll over their existing loans that were coming due without this IMF deal. So this was always baked into the cake. In fact, they had hired somebody that was a former that worked for the IMF before. They'd brought this person on a few years ago to help them through this process. Even in the past 2 years, bonds that they released had a condition in them that if they got the IMF deal, the interest rate they would pay was a lower rate than if they did not get the IMF deal. So all along, the government was planning on doing the IMF deal. Of course, they were playing like they weren't, because they wanted to negotiate and make sure that they could get the best terms. So they kept telling the IMF, hey, we're going to tell you to pound sand, and we're going to do it our own way. But they were also realistic and knew they had to roll over this debt. And so it's funny, they actually pushed the IMF into a corner, because they waited till Bitcoin price was up, till Donald Trump was going to be in office, till all these other things that were favorable for them. Then that's when they actually negotiated. And they gave the IMF these little sound bites that they could claim victory of things that they, I believe, actually wanted. As far as requiring businesses to accept Bitcoin, that was never implemented. Businesses were never forced to accept Bitcoin. It was technically in the law, but they gave them all these outs, and no businesses were ever sanctioned or fined or any way pushed to accept Bitcoin. And so this basically just codified that. And ironically, a lot of Bitcoiners complained initially when they put that in the law, because we believe in freedom, and we don't think that the government should force people to do things. And so the IMF kind of pushed for what a lot of Bitcoiners wanted. Okay. And so I think that the things that they gave them, as far as getting rid of the Chivo wallet, not forcing companies to accept Bitcoin, were things that they kind of wanted to do anyways, but it allowed the IMF to kind of save face and still give the loan while claiming that they got concessions from the Salvadoran government. But you look at the terms of the loan, I think that the interest rate was, between 2% and 3% on this loan that they got. El Salvador didn't have to put up any collateral. I mean, any of us Bitcoiners here would take a 2 to 3% loan without any collateral any day, right? So that we could just hodl our Bitcoin. So
yes, but crucially, the Bitcoiners in this room would probably take that loan to buy more Bitcoin, whereas El Salvador, according to the IMF law, it is not buying more Bitcoin. It is not able to move more funds buy more Bitcoin. Is that not the case?
That's technically the case, but this is the funny thing. El Salvador would have actually had to sell all their existing Bitcoin that they have to meet these loans that were coming due. Otherwise, they would have defaulted, which would have been a disaster for the economy. So by getting this IMF loan, they were able to continue to hold on to the Bitcoin that they have, and they have, according to them, continued to buy Bitcoin, and I think they've found some loopholes.
Okay.
And people get frustrated by this because they're like, well, are they buying it or not? And it's like, you have to understand, in real politics, you have to find a way so both sides can claim victory. So the IMF wants to claim that, no, we got concessions, and El Salvador can claim, no, we didn't really give up anything. And both sides are content to have it like that because they can go back to their backers and say, no, we won. And people keep trying to force that issue, but I think there's a real reason that it's vague and nobody's providing any clarification because both sides realize for them both to win, they have to leave it very vague.
Okay, but let's just pretend this room isn't here, the live stream isn't running, and we're totally off the record. Is El Salvador buying Bitcoin every day?
I don't know, to be honest.
Okay.
And for me, I don't really care. That was never the thing I was most excited about. The whole Bitcoin treasury and strategic reserve in Bitcoin, I think, is much less important than giving everyday people access to freedom money. And so I think it's what you look at El Salvador. Like, I think they did a survey. I think it was a year ago. 99% of people in El Salvador know what Bitcoin is and have some understanding of it. And only, I think it was like 8% of them know what Ethereum is. Where else in the world can you look at a place where you have that kind of Bitcoin recognition, but without all the shit coins to go along with it?
Yeah, no, that is impressive. In fact, my nemesis, Joe Nakamoto, did do street interviews asking El Salvadorans about Bitcoin, and they all recognized it immediately. So you could say that, yes, El Salvador is to an extent still Bitcoin country because almost every Salvadoran knows what Bitcoin is, and there is no nation on earth where you could say that about a populace. Okay, let's move on to something different here, because from what I'm gathering from your sort of summation of what's going on in El Salvador, it's that Bukele is this rather master marketer, a deal breaker, and he's very good, at marketing. He uses Bitcoin in the branding, but when it comes to budgeting, he's kind of forgotten the Bitcoin thing. So is this now more about optics, the idea of attracting Bitcoiners, Bitcoiner tourists, than genuine monetary reform, the part of Bitcoin that you care most about?
No, I think it's both. He is a brilliant marketer. I mean, he has put El Salvador on the map. Probably nobody in this, the majority of people in this room wouldn't have known where El Salvador was 5 or 6 years ago, where almost all Bitcoiners and just people in general in the world now know where El Salvador is. And so we've seen this surge of tourism. We've seen billions of extra dollars come into the country, and some of that flowing into sats. And so I think that the marketing part is important. As a leader of a country, trying to take it from one of the poorest countries with the highest murder rate in the world and to attract businesses and intellectual and financial capital into the country so that it can be remade for the people, you have to go out and market that. You don't start out with a very great story. And so he has found a way to convince people who have a low time preference to move to El Salvador and to help transform it. And so I think it's kind of like Elon Musk, like he puts these moonshot ideas out there, and they don't always come to fruition right away, but you are shocked at the number of them that people doubted that actually do come into fruition longer term. So I think that the people that are that are short selling El Salvador right now are going to come to regret it, because these things in the long term, I think he's going to show the world that he can do it.
Interesting. So I guess the follow-up to that is that if you remove Bukele from the equation, let's say he doesn't become a dictator and live, for 30 years as leader of El Salvador. Let's say he gets voted out at the next election. Would Bitcoin and the Bitcoin story in El Salvador survive without this orange-tinted PR campaign?
That's the great thing about how it happened in El Salvador, is it really was a grassroots up story. It wasn't a government forced down. And so, yes, I believe you have enough real adoption in El Salvador. It is one of the only places in the world where you can live on a Bitcoin standard. There are numerous people there that only spend Bitcoin. And so, while not all businesses accept it, you can do all your daily spending in Bitcoin very easy. You can buy vehicles from a new car dealership. You can buy properties. The main supermarket accepts it. Their version of Costco accepts it. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of small stores. And so it really is a place where Bitcoin is used by the normal people. And that's what I love, too. It came from those on the lowest rung of the economic ladder. Bitcoiners would get freaked out when they would come to El Salvador because they're like, ooh, people have a Bitcoin sticker on their motorcycle, or they're wearing a Bitcoin shirt. Aren't they worried they're going to become a target because people's going to think they have money? It's like, no, in El Salvador, Bitcoin's the money of the poor. Like, people don't think of that as you're rich because you use Bitcoin. people use Bitcoin are the people that have been excluded from the traditional financial system. So I think you have enough of that base, and that will continue to grow. Now, don't get me wrong, it's always better to have the government as a tailwind rather than a headwind. If you're in a place where the government is fighting against you, is threatening to throw you in jail, is threatening Bitcoin companies, you're going to stifle can't speak here. You're going to stifle innovation. And so I think the fact that we have El Salvador that is given their full support of Bitcoin, you are going to see it grow faster there than anywhere else in the world. But I don't think it's dependent on government.
Okay, interesting. I mean, it's fair to say that El Sonte is still running on Bitcoin. There are many places that still do accept Bitcoin across El Salvador. But outside of these circular economies, these very specific projects and some of these chains you mentioned, it does feel that Bitcoin adoption is almost invisible. So, without this large marketing campaign from the top, isn't it fair to say that it's Bitcoiners who made the country Bitcoin country? It's not the country that has made Bitcoiners.
I think it's both. I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think they've had this symbiotic relationship. You had a small project that encouraged a country to adopt Bitcoin, which encouraged Bitcoiners to come in, to bring their intellectual and financial capital, to locate their companies in there, which has increased job opportunities, which has encouraged the country to grow, which has brought in, even auxiliary industry in and has made, El Salvador's economy a boom. So I don't think it's one or the other. I think they've done in tandem. This would be much more challenging if we were trying to do the same thing in a country that was very anti-Bitcoin. So I think when you have a top-down and bottom-up working together, you're going to have much faster adoption, but it's still going to take decades. Like, you look how long it took the dollar to become the dominant in the world. Like, it doesn't happen overnight. And so I think 10 years from now, people will be like, oh yeah, it's amazing, how quickly Bitcoin took over in El Salvador, where right now people are complaining that it's happening too slowly.
Yeah, the old Bitcoiner phrase, lower your time preference, comes to mind. Okay, so we're coming to the last couple of minutes, Mike. Let's define it. What does it mean? What does it take to be a Bitcoin country? Is it legal tender laws? Is it everyday use? Is it circular economies across the country? Is it that the nation state, the government, is stacking Bitcoin? Because if it's these points, then of course El Sonte qualifies, Bitcoin Berlin qualifies, but the entire nation does not qualify anymore, whereas it did a couple of years ago. What is it that makes a country a Bitcoin country?
I think it's a country that has adopted a stance towards freedom of, we want to have a currency that the government doesn't control. So El Salvador does not have their own currency. They've been using the dollar in the past, and they've said, why are we using this currency that somebody else has the control over? Let's use a decentralized, permissionless currency where we're on the same playing field as everywhere else. When the US government starts printing money, it doesn't make all our people poor. And so I think the fact that they have opened up to this, they were willing to go against the IMF. They were willing to go against, at that time when they adopted, the US government was very critical of what they were doing. Now they've actually led the way for the US, where the US has kind of switched and now realizes that they don't want to be left behind. So it's amazing you had this small country willing to lead the way, but it's still going to take you don't have these changes happen overnight. You don't have a country that was one of the poorest with the highest murder rate in the world, like, transformed in 1 year. This is going to be a decade-plus project, but we're seeing this amazing progress that if you would have asked people 5 years ago, they would have said it was impossible.
Right, interesting. I'm going to refer to the audience now for the last bit. Could you please raise your hand if you do not think that El Salvador is Bitcoin country? Raise your hand if you do not think El Salvador is Bitcoin country. For the live stream and for the cameras, not a single hand was raised. Okay, let's do it. Who thinks El Salvador is still Bitcoin country? 2 hands from Mike. Yeah, I think it's fair to say I think you've settled that debate. I'm going to just... Yes, yeah, 2 hands from Roman. I'm going to quit being Joseph Dividends. I'm not going to take this off, but yeah, I'm back to being Joe Nakamoto, okay? Like, just pretend I'm Joe Nakamoto again. I would encourage everyone in this room to visit El Salvador, to experience the change that is taking place in Bitcoin country. It is still, of course, Bitcoin country, and I don't think a loan from the IMF is going to change that. Is there a message that you would like the audience to go home with today, as we have 1 minute left?
Yeah, definitely come to El Salvador and judge for yourself. Like, don't take anybody else's word for it, whether it's Bitcoiners or the mainstream press. Come to El Salvador, spend your sats, and you decide whether or not there's something different happening in El Salvador. And I'm going to show your videos there because I feel like Joe does a great job of giving a real view of the challenges of using Bitcoin, but also where it's really being used there. So check out Joe's video, and then if you want to know more about what's happening in El Salvador, we have the Live from Bitcoin Beach podcast, and we interview people that are actually on the ground in El Salvador and seeing this change. So, but mostly just get out there and experience it for yourself.
Yeah. Mike is a local legend. He won't say it himself, but yeah, he's the person that inspired this Bitcoin movement in El Salvador, and himself with Chimbeira. There will be park benches, there will be statues made after you, long into the future. I'm serious. I'm going to sit on that park bench, Mike. It is, yeah, give it up for Mike. Thank you so much, you all, for being with us this afternoon. That concludes our panel on whether or not El Salvador is still Bitcoin country. It obviously is. I have been Joe Nakamoto. That was my arch nemesis, Joseph Dividends. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much. Muchas gracias.